I stood in my empty driveway, staring at the oil stain where my diesel pickup had been parked just 8 hours earlier. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone to call the police. This was not just a missing vehicle. This was theft, pure and simple. But as I dialed, I heard the sound of high heels clicking on pavement behind me. I turned around to see Corinne, my neighbor, walking toward me with the biggest smile I had ever seen on her face. She was practically glowing with satisfaction. "Oh, did you lose something?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake concern. That was the moment I realized this woman had crossed a line that would cost her everything. She thought she had won by having my truck towed on false charges. She had no idea that her illegal actions were about to backfire in ways she never imagined. Moving into Meadowbrook Estates felt like winning the lottery. After 15 years of apartment living and saving every penny, I finally had the keys to my own home in one of the most beautiful neighborhoods in town. The streets were lined with mature oak trees. Every lawn was perfectly manicured, and the houses looked like something out of a magazine. I pulled my diesel pickup truck into the driveway of my new home and sat there for a moment, just taking it all in. This truck represented everything I had worked for. Every early morning, every overtime shift, every weekend job that helped me save for this house. It was not just transportation. It was proof that hard work pays off. The neighborhood had rules, of course. I had read through the entire HOA handbook before signing the purchase agreement. 23 pages of regulations about everything from mailbox colors to lawn height requirements. But I was not worried. I had always been the type of person who followed rules and respected authority. That first week was perfect. Neighbors waved as they walked their dogs. The mail carrier was friendly. Even the landscaping crew that maintained the common areas nodded politely when they saw me. I thought I had found paradise. Then I met Corinne. She appeared on my doorstep on a Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand, wearing a bright yellow vest that said HOA Compliance Officer in bold letters. She was probably in her 50s, with short brown hair and the kind of smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, but her gaze was not on me. She was staring past me at my truck in the driveway. "I am Corinne Walsh, and I help ensure our community standards are maintained." I invited her in for coffee, thinking this was just a friendly welcome visit. But Corinne declined. She kept looking at my truck, making notes on her clipboard, and asking questions about my work schedule and vehicle usage. "That is quite a large truck," she said finally. "We do not see many diesel vehicles in this neighborhood." I explained that I worked in construction and needed the truck for hauling equipment. Everything was perfectly legal according to the HOA bylaws. I had checked multiple times before buying the house. Corinne smiled that cold smile again. "Well, we will see about that." 2 days later, I found a folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. It was a friendly reminder about vehicle compliance, printed on official HOA letterhead. The note mentioned environmental concerns and community aesthetic standards, but did not cite any specific violations. I spent that evening going through the HOA bylaws page by page. Section 7.3 clearly stated that residents could park personal vehicles in their driveways, including trucks and commercial vehicles, as long as they were properly registered and maintained. There was no mention of engine type restrictions or diesel fuel prohibitions. But over the next few days, I started noticing Corinne everywhere. She would drive slowly past my house multiple times each day, sometimes stopping to take photos of my truck with her phone. She would appear when I was getting home from work, pretending to check her mailbox while obviously watching me. The woman was obsessed, and I was starting to realize that my perfect neighborhood paradise might have a very big problem named Karen. Karen's surveillance campaign escalated quickly. What started as occasional drive-bys became a daily routine. Every morning at 7:30, like clockwork, her white sedan would cruise past my house. She would slow down, take photos through her passenger window, and make notes on a pad she kept on her dashboard. The violation notices started arriving weekly. Each one was more ridiculous than the last. Environmental impact concerns, potential noise violations, community aesthetic degradation. None of them cited actual HOA rules because no actual rules were being broken. I tried to ignore it at first. Karen was clearly one of those HOA busybodies who had nothing better to do than harass her neighbors. But when she started involving other board members, I realized this was becoming serious. On a Thursday evening, I was washing my truck in the driveway when Karen appeared with two other people. She introduced them as HOA board members Sandra Mills and Robert Chen. Sandra looked uncomfortable, but Robert seemed to be buying into Karen's narrative completely. "We need to discuss your vehicle situation," Karen announced, pointing at my truck like it was some kind of toxic waste dump. I kept my voice calm and respectful. "What situation would that be? My truck is legally parked in my own driveway." "Diesel vehicles are destroying our property values," Karen declared. "The smell, the noise, the environmental impact. This is a family neighborhood, not a truck stop." Robert nodded along. "The board has received multiple complaints about commercial vehicles being parked in residential driveways." That was interesting. Multiple complaints. I wondered if Karen had been filing complaints under different names or if she had convinced other neighbors to join her crusade. I went inside and printed out the relevant sections of the HOA bylaws. Page 12, Section 7.3, was crystal clear. Personal vehicles, including trucks, were allowed in driveways. There were no restrictions based on engine type, fuel type, or vehicle size within reasonable limits. I handed Robert the printed pages. "Here are the actual rules. My truck is completely compliant with all HOA regulations." Karen barely glanced at the papers before dismissing them with a wave of her hand. "Those bylaws are outdated. The city has new ordinances about commercial vehicle usage in residential areas. I have higher authority than some old neighborhood rules." Higher authority. Those words sent a chill down my spine. Karen was claiming authority she did not have and dismissing legal documents that proved her wrong. This woman was not just difficult. She was dangerous. Sandra finally spoke up. "Karen, maybe we should table this discussion and research the current regulations before making any decisions." But Karen was not interested in research or facts. She wanted my truck gone, and she was willing to make up authority she did not possess to make it happen. Over the next 2 weeks, the neighborhood began choosing sides. Some neighbors avoided eye contact when they saw me, clearly uncomfortable with the conflict but not wanting to get involved. Others whispered words of support, telling me privately that Karen had been a problem for years but no one wanted to challenge her. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who lived 2 houses down, approached me while I was getting my mail. She looked around nervously before speaking. "That woman has been making life miserable for everyone," she whispered. "She reported my son for parking his work van in my driveway when he visits. She called code enforcement on the Johnsons for having a basketball hoop. Nobody wants to say anything because she makes life hell for anyone who crosses her." I was starting to understand that this was not really about my truck. This was about Corinne establishing dominance and control over the entire neighborhood through intimidation and harassment. She had found a system that worked, and she was going to keep using it until someone stopped her. The breaking point came on a Monday morning when I found Corinne in my driveway, measuring the distance between my truck and the property line with a tape measure. She was taking photos from multiple angles and making detailed notes on a legal pad. "What are you doing on my property?" I asked. She looked up without any trace of embarrassment. "Gathering evidence for my report to the city. Your truck is in violation of multiple ordinances, and the authorities need proper documentation." That was when I realized Corinne was not going to stop. She had moved beyond HOA harassment into something much more serious, and I had no idea how far she was willing to go to get what she wanted. I had reached my breaking point with Corinne's harassment, so I decided to go over her head to the actual authorities. The next morning, I called the HOA management company that handled our neighborhood's administrative affairs. The conversation with Janet Morrison, the property manager, was eye-opening. She listened patiently as I explained the situation with Corinne and the constant violation notices about my diesel truck. "Mr. Johnson," Janet said, and I could hear her typing on her computer, "I am looking at your property file right now. There are no active violations against your address. In fact, there are no vehicle-related complaints of any kind." That was interesting. Corinne had been sending me official-looking violation notices, but apparently she had not been filing them with the management company. "Let me be very clear about the vehicle policy," Janet continued. "Section 7.3 of your HOA bylaws explicitly allows personal vehicles in driveways, including pickup trucks. There are no restrictions based on engine type. Your diesel truck is completely compliant with all neighborhood regulations." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Finally, someone in authority was confirming what I had known all along. My truck was legal, and Corinne had been harassing me over nothing. "I would like to schedule a meeting with the HOA board," I said. "This situation has gotten out of hand, and I think they need to know what Corinne has been doing." The board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the community center. I arrived early and brought copies of all the violation notices Corinne had left on my truck, along with photos of her surveilling my property. Board President Michael Torres was a reasonable man in his 60s who had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade. He listened carefully as I presented my case, examining the fake violation notices and shaking his head in disbelief. "I want to apologize on behalf of the board," Michael said. "Corinne has been acting without any official authority. These violation notices are not legitimate HOA documents, and she had no right to issue them." The other board members looked embarrassed and uncomfortable. It was clear that Corinne had been freelancing her enforcement activities without their knowledge or approval. "We will speak to Corinne immediately about her unauthorized actions," Michael promised. "This kind of harassment will not be tolerated in our community." For the first time in weeks, I felt hopeful. The system had worked. Reasonable people had reviewed the facts and sided with truth over Corinne's manufactured drama. I went home that night feeling like the conflict was finally over. For about 10 days, it seemed like I was right. Corinne stopped her daily drive-bys. The fake violation notices stopped appearing on my truck. She even waved politely when we crossed paths at the mailbox, though her smile looked forced and artificial. I started to relax and enjoy my neighborhood again. The stress that had been building for weeks began to fade. Maybe Corinne had learned her lesson. Maybe she would find a new hobby that did not involve harassing her neighbors. But I was wrong. Corinne had not given up. She had just changed tactics. I found out later that during those quiet 10 days, Corinne had been busy behind the scenes. She had contacted the city code enforcement office multiple times, filing complaints about my truck under different pretenses. She told them it was an abandoned commercial vehicle. She claimed it was being used for business purposes in a residential zone. She even suggested it might be stolen property. The city code enforcement officers had no way of knowing that Corinne was a neighbor with a personal vendetta. To them, she was just a concerned citizen reporting potential violations. They took her complaints at face value and began building a case file based on her false information. I had no idea any of this was happening. Corinne's fake friendliness during those 10 days was just a cover while she worked with outside authorities to accomplish what she could not do through the HOA. Looking back, I should have recognized the warning signs. Corinne's sudden change in behavior was too dramatic to be genuine. Her artificial smiles and forced politeness should have told me she was planning something bigger. But at the time, I thought I had won. I thought reasonable people prevailing over Corinne's nonsense was the end of the story. I had no idea that the real battle was just beginning, and Corinne was about to escalate this conflict far beyond anything I could have imagined. I knew something was wrong the moment I turned onto my street after work. There was an empty space in my driveway where my diesel pickup should have been parked. At first, my brain could not process what I was seeing. I had definitely parked it there that morning before leaving for my construction job site. I pulled into the empty driveway and sat in my car for a moment, trying to think of logical explanations. Maybe I had parked somewhere else and forgotten. Maybe my wife had needed to use the truck for something. But even as I went through these possibilities, I knew they were not true. My hands were shaking as I got out of the car and walked around the driveway, looking for clues. There were fresh tire marks on the asphalt leading from my parking spot to the street. Someone had towed my truck. I ran inside and called my wife, but she was at work and had not touched the truck. I called the police non-emergency line, thinking maybe it had been stolen, but they told me to check with local tow companies first. That was when I heard the clicking of high heels on the sidewalk behind me. I turned around to see Corinne approaching with the biggest, most satisfied smile I had ever seen on her face. She was practically glowing with triumph. "Oh, did you lose something?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake concern. My blood pressure spiked instantly. "Where is my truck, Corinne?" She tilted her head innocently. "I have no idea what you mean, but I did report an abandoned commercial vehicle to the city this morning. Code enforcement takes those violations very seriously." The pieces clicked into place immediately. Corinne had called the city and made false reports about my truck, causing it to be towed from my own driveway. "That truck was not abandoned," I said, trying to keep my voice under control. "It was legally parked in my own driveway." Corinne shrugged. "Well, that is for the authorities to determine. I just report what I see, and I saw a large commercial diesel truck that had been sitting in the same spot for weeks. It looked abandoned to me." I wanted to scream at her, but I forced myself to walk away and call the city code enforcement office instead. The officer who answered confirmed that my truck had been towed based on a complaint about an abandoned commercial vehicle. "Ma'am, this truck was not abandoned," I explained. "It was parked in my own driveway. I drive it to work every day." "You will need to take that up with the tow yard," the officer replied. "They are the ones who impounded the vehicle." The tow yard was a nightmare. It was located in an industrial area across town, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The office was a small trailer that smelled like cigarettes and motor oil. $400, the clerk said when I explained why I was there, plus $25 per day storage fee, cash only. $400. I felt sick to my stomach. I was being forced to pay $400 because Corinne had lied to the city about my truck being abandoned. This is ridiculous, I said. The truck was not abandoned. It was illegally towed from my own property based on false information. The clerk shrugged. Take it up with the city. I just store the vehicles and collect the fees. I did not have a choice. I needed my truck for work the next morning, and every day it sat in the tow yard would cost me another $25. I paid the $400 in cash, watching my savings account take a hit because of Corinne's vindictive lies. When I got back to my neighborhood with my truck, Corinne was outside watering her flowers. She watched me pull into my driveway with obvious disappointment that I had gotten my vehicle back so quickly. But the worst part came later that evening. I was working in my garage when I heard Corinne talking loudly to another neighbor in her front yard. "I am just glad we were able to clean up the neighborhood a little bit," she was saying. "That diesel truck was really bringing down the aesthetic of our community. Hopefully, this sends a message about maintaining proper standards." She was bragging about what she had done. She was publicly celebrating the fact that she had cost me $400 through false reports to the city. Corinne was not just a busybody or a difficult neighbor. She was a malicious person who took pleasure in hurting others. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the tow yard receipt in front of me. $400 for storage fees, gas money to drive across town twice, a half day of lost wages because I had to deal with this mess instead of working. But the financial cost was nothing compared to the emotional damage. I no longer felt safe in my own home. Corinne had proven that she was willing to lie to government authorities to get what she wanted. If she could have my truck towed on false charges, what else was she capable of? I realized that this was not over. Corinne had won this round, but she had also showed me exactly what kind of person I was dealing with. And I was going to make sure she never had the chance to do this to me or anyone else ever again. The morning after getting my truck back from the tow yard, I made a decision that would change everything. I was not going to let Corinne get away with what she had done. If she wanted to play games with false reports and illegal towing, I was going to document every single thing she had done and build a case that would end her reign of neighborhood terror once and for all. I started by creating a detailed timeline of Corinne's harassment campaign. Every fake violation notice, every surveillance incident, every confrontation was logged with dates, times, and witnesses when possible. I took photographs of all the bogus HOA documents she had left on my truck, making sure to capture the letterhead and signature lines that made them look official. The tow yard receipt became evidence item number one. $400 in fees, plus the additional costs and lost wages from having to retrieve my truck. But I needed to understand exactly what Corinne had told the city to get them to authorize the towing. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the City Code Enforcement Office, asking for copies of all complaints and reports related to my address and vehicle. What I discovered made my blood boil. Corinne had filed not one, but 3 separate complaints over a 2-week period. In the first report, she claimed my truck was an abandoned commercial vehicle that had been sitting unused for months. In the second report, she said I was operating an illegal business from my residence using the truck for commercial deliveries. In the third report, she suggested the vehicle might be stolen because she never saw anyone driving it. Every single statement was a complete lie. I drove that truck to work every day. I had registration and insurance documents proving ownership. There was no commercial business operating from my home address. But Corinne's lies were not the most shocking discovery. As I dug deeper into her background, I found out that this was not her first time weaponizing government agencies against her neighbors. I started knocking on doors and having conversations with longtime residents of the neighborhood. What I learned painted a picture of a woman who had been terrorizing this community for years. Tom Bradley, who lived 3 streets over, told me about Corinne's campaign against his teenage son's car. She called code enforcement 6 times claiming it was an unregistered vehicle, he said. Cost me over $300 in fees and paperwork to prove the registration was current. Maria Santos had a similar story about Corinne, reporting her elderly mother's visiting nurse for commercial vehicle violations, because the nurse drove a van with medical equipment. The Hendersons had dealt with Corinne calling the city about their fence height, their mailbox placement, and even their children's bicycles being left in the driveway. A pattern was emerging. Corinne had discovered that she could harass her neighbors by making false reports to city agencies, knowing that most people would not have the time, money, or energy to fight back. She had been using this tactic for years to control and intimidate anyone who did not meet her personal standards for neighborhood perfection. But I also discovered something else. None of these neighbors had ever fought back. They had all paid the fees, moved their vehicles, changed their behaviors, and tried to avoid Corinne's attention. She had never faced any real consequences for her false reports. That was about to change. I called the law office of Patricia Kim, an attorney who specialized in harassment and civil rights cases. I had found her name through an online search for lawyers who handled wrongful towing cases. Patricia listened carefully as I explained the situation and reviewed all the evidence I had gathered. The timeline of harassment, the false reports to the city, the financial costs, and the pattern of similar behavior toward other neighbors. "You have a very strong case," she said after reviewing everything. "False reporting to government agencies is illegal. Harassment campaigns like this can result in both criminal charges and civil liability. The city is also potentially liable for acting on these false reports without proper investigation." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had real power in the situation. Corinne had been operating with impunity for years because no one had ever challenged her tactics, but she had picked the wrong neighbor this time. Patricia explained that we could pursue multiple legal avenues: a civil lawsuit against Corinne for harassment, defamation, and causing financial damages, a complaint against the city for wrongful towing based on false information, and potentially criminal charges for filing false reports with government agencies. "The most important thing," Patricia said, "is that we send a clear message that this behavior will not be tolerated. Corinne needs to face real consequences, or she will just keep doing this to other people." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. This was not just about getting my $400 back anymore. This was about stopping a neighborhood bully who had been abusing the system for years. As I left Patricia's office that day, I felt a sense of purpose I had not experienced since this whole mess started. Corinne thought she had won by having my truck towed. She thought she could intimidate me into submission like she had done with so many other neighbors. She was about to learn that she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Patricia Kim wasted no time launching our legal counterattack. Within a week of our initial consultation, she had filed formal complaints with both the city and the HOA, demanding immediate action and financial compensation for Corinne's pattern of harassment and false reporting. The complaint against the city was devastating in its detail. Patricia had documented every false report Corinne had made, not just about my truck, but about other neighbors as well. She showed how the city had repeatedly acted on Corinne's complaints without conducting proper investigations, creating a system that enabled her harassment campaign. The city has a legal obligation to verify complaints before taking enforcement action, Patricia explained as we reviewed the filing. By repeatedly accepting Corinne's false reports at face value, they became complicit in her harassment scheme. The demand letter to the HOA was equally comprehensive. It held the association liable for Corinne's unauthorized enforcement activities and demanded they take immediate action to stop her fake compliance campaigns. Patricia had included testimony from multiple neighbors about Corinne's years of abuse and intimidation. But the most satisfying moment came when Corinne was served with the legal documents. I happened to be checking my mailbox when the process server arrived at her house. I watched from across the street as Corinne answered her door and was handed the thick envelope of legal papers. Her face went white as she read the first page. The confident, smug expression she had worn for months disappeared instantly, replaced by something I had never seen from her before: genuine fear. Within an hour of being served, Corinne was knocking on my door. But this was not the same woman who had been terrorizing the neighborhood for years. This Corinne was panicked, desperate, and clearly out of her depth. "We need to talk," she said, and for the first time since I had known her, her voice was shaking. "This legal stuff is getting out of hand. Maybe we can work something out." I looked at her calmly. "You can talk to my attorney. I have nothing to say to you directly." "But this is all just a misunderstanding," she insisted. "I was just trying to maintain community standards. Surely we can resolve this without involving lawyers and courts." The irony was not lost on me. Corinne had been perfectly happy to involve city code enforcement and tow truck companies when she thought she had the upper hand. But now that she was facing real legal consequences for her actions, suddenly she wanted to talk like reasonable neighbors. "The time for reasonable conversation was before you lied to the city and had my truck illegally towed," I said. "You made this a legal matter. Now we are going to resolve it through legal channels." Corinne tried a few more desperate approaches over the next several days. She contacted other HOA board members, trying to rally support for her position. But the board members had read the legal documents and understood the potential liability they faced. Instead of backing Corinne, they distanced themselves from her actions as quickly as possible. Michael Torres, the HOA president, called me personally to discuss the situation. "The board wants you to know that we had no knowledge of Corinne's unauthorized enforcement activities," he said. "We are taking immediate action to ensure this never happens again." The board voted unanimously to strip Corinne of any authority to issue violation notices or represent the HOA in any capacity. They also voted to censure her officially for exceeding her authority and causing legal liability for the association. But the real pressure came when the HOA's insurance company got involved. Once they understood that Corinne's actions could result in significant financial judgments against the association, they demanded immediate resolution of the matter. Within 2 weeks of filing our complaints, I received settlement offers from both the city and the HOA. The city offered $6,000 to resolve all claims related to the wrongful towing incident. This covered not just the $400 in tow yard fees, but also my lost wages, legal costs, and damages for the harassment I had endured. The HOA offered an additional $4,000 to settle the harassment claims and ensure that Karen would never again have any authority to enforce neighborhood rules. Patricia reviewed both offers carefully. "These are fair settlements," she said. "The amounts reflect the seriousness of what happened and send a clear message that this behavior will not be tolerated." But the best part was yet to come. As word of the settlement spread through the neighborhood, other victims of Karen's harassment began coming forward. Tom Bradley, Maria Santos, the Hendersons, and several other families started discussing their own potential legal actions against Karen for her years of false reports and intimidation. Karen found herself facing not just my lawsuit, but the possibility of multiple legal actions from neighbors she had harassed over the years. The legal fees alone would be devastating, not to mention the potential judgments if she lost in court. The woman who had once strutted around the neighborhood like she owned it was now barely leaving her house. When she did venture outside, she avoided eye contact with everyone and hurried back inside as quickly as possible. Her reign of terror was over. After years of using false authority and manufactured rules to control her neighbors, Karen was finally facing real consequences for her actions. And she was discovering that when you abuse power you do not actually have, eventually someone will call your bluff. The legal system that she had manipulated and weaponized against innocent neighbors was now being used against her. And unlike her victims, Karen could not simply pay a fee and make the problem go away. Her actions had created real legal liability that would follow her for years to come. Justice was finally being served, and it was more satisfying than I had ever imagined it could be. The settlement checks arrived on the same day, almost like the universe was orchestrating perfect timing for my vindication. $6,000 from the city of Meadowbrook, covering the wrongful towing fees, lost wages, legal costs, and compensation for harassment. $4,000 from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, acknowledging their liability for Karen's unauthorized enforcement actions. $10,000 total, not bad for standing up to a neighborhood bully. But the money was not the most satisfying part of this victory. The real satisfaction came from watching Karen's world crumble around her, as the consequences of her years of abuse finally caught up with her. The HOA board meeting where Karen's censure was announced was packed with neighbors who had never bothered attending before. Michael Torres read the official statement in a clear, firm voice that left no room for misinterpretation. The board unanimously finds that Karen Walsh exceeded her authority, made false representations to government agencies, and caused significant legal and financial liability for our association. Effective immediately, Mrs. Walsh is stripped of all HOA enforcement duties and is prohibited from representing herself as having any official capacity within our neighborhood organization. Karen sat in the front row during this announcement, her face red with embarrassment and anger. She tried to interrupt several times to defend her actions, but Michael shut her down each time. "Mrs. Walsh, you will have an opportunity to speak during the public comment period. Right now, the board is reading our official findings." When Karen finally got her chance to speak, her defense was pathetic and desperate. She claimed she had been protecting property values. She said she was just following city ordinances that supposedly superseded HOA rules. She even suggested that I was the real problem for bringing legal action over what she called minor neighborhood disputes. But her words fell on deaf ears. The neighbors in that room had read the legal documents. They understood that Karen had been filing false reports with government agencies for years. They knew she had cost multiple families thousands of dollars through her harassment campaigns. Tom Bradley stood up during the public comment period and shared his story about Corinne's attacks on his son's car. Maria Santos talked about the harassment her elderly mother's visiting nurse had endured. The Hendersons described years of false complaints about their fence, their mailbox, and even their children's bicycles. One by one, Corinne's victims found their voices. People who had been intimidated into silence for years finally felt safe enough to speak out publicly about what she had done to them. The most powerful moment came when Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who had first warned me about Corinne's tactics, slowly made her way to the microphone. Her voice was quiet but steady as she addressed the room. "I have lived in this neighborhood for 37 years," she said. "I have watched it grow and change, and I have always been proud to call it home. But for the past 5 years, one person has made this community a place of fear and anxiety for many of us. Tonight, I finally feel like we have our neighborhood back." The room erupted in applause. Corinne looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. After the meeting, something beautiful happened. Neighbors who had been avoiding each other out of fear of getting caught in Corinne's crosshairs began talking and connecting. People shared phone numbers and made plans for block parties. The artificial divisions Corinne had created through her intimidation tactics began healing immediately. But Corinne's humiliation was far from over. Word of the settlement amounts had spread through the neighborhood gossip network, and everyone knew she was facing significant financial consequences for her actions. The legal fees alone were substantial, and she still faced potential additional lawsuits from other neighbors. Within a month of the board meeting, a "for sale" sign appeared in Corinne's front yard. She had apparently decided that staying in the neighborhood where her reputation was completely destroyed was not an option. I watched from my window as she loaded boxes into a moving truck 6 weeks later. She worked quickly and quietly, avoiding eye contact with anyone who passed by. The woman who had once patrolled the neighborhood like she owned it was sneaking away in defeat. Her house sold quickly to a lovely young couple with twin toddlers. When I introduced myself to them, they mentioned that their real estate agent had told them about some previous neighborhood disputes that had been resolved before they moved in. "We are just happy to be in such a peaceful community," the wife said as her children played in their new front yard. Peaceful. That was exactly the right word for what our neighborhood had become again. The settlement money allowed me to make some nice improvements to my house and truck. But more importantly, it validated that standing up to bullies is not just the right thing to do morally. It can also be financially rewarding when those bullies break the law. 6 months after Corinne moved away, I received a letter from Tom Bradley thanking me for taking action that had inspired him to pursue his own legal case against her. He eventually received a settlement of $3,500 for the harassment his family had endured. Maria Santos filed a complaint with the state attorney general's office about Corinne's pattern of filing false reports with government agencies. While I never learned the outcome of that investigation, I liked knowing that Corinne's actions were being reviewed by authorities with real power to hold her accountable. As I write this story, it has been over a year since Corinne moved away from Meadowbrook Estates. Our neighborhood has returned to the peaceful, friendly community I thought I was buying into originally. Children ride their bikes in the streets again, without fear of triggering false code enforcement reports. Neighbors wave to each other and actually stop to chat instead of hurrying inside to avoid unwanted confrontations. The lesson I learned from this experience is simple. Bullies only have as much power as we give them. Corinne terrorized our neighborhood for years because no one had ever stood up to her tactics and demanded real consequences for her behavior. But when someone finally called her bluff and forced her to face the legal system she had been abusing, her house of cards collapsed immediately. She was never as powerful as she pretended to be. She was just a bitter person who had learned to weaponize government bureaucracy against her neighbors. And in the end, justice was not just served. It was served with a $10,000 price tag that made standing up to her the most profitable decision I ever made.